works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We will do that.
We will do that.
Okay.
But we are a small group. We can always, if you want, and I'm able to do that with my German English, we can also talk about, you can interrupt me and we can, so to say, in an informal way, if you want. I prepared your lecture for minimum 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
60 minutes, yeah, around.
We won't interrupt you.
Yeah.
As long as before we leave, we extrapolate the maximum possible personal gossip about the two people.
Well, we had that at lunch, but he can summarize it.
I can summarize it, and please feel free whenever you have a suggestion or question. I hope that there will be some interesting and maybe some funny stories.
May I just apologize in advance that the Just War Conference has invited me to their banquet. I will listen as long as I can here. And
Okay.
may have to.
Yes, of course, the banquet, as we know.
Yeah, banquets can't be missed.
On
Symposium
which
is
side
very-
of the question, do you lunch or do you dine?
Enough. Let us go on to our.
Let me introduce Thomas Meyer, who's here from Germany, although he's teaching at the University of Chicago this semester. Officially as part of the Divinity School, but also teaching in the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. And he is doing research for the year, as far as I understand it, in the archives of the Leo Strauss letters and archives that are at the University of Chicago.
Yeah. For example, yeah.
For example, he came to us, as I said earlier, from at the recommendation of David Kettler, so I am grateful to David for that. Thomas has written many books, a number on Ernst Cassirer, a number on Jewish law and Jewish thought. Interestingly enough, specifically between 1933 and 1938, so a very interesting period for German thinking. And he has most recently been interested in the work of Leo Strauss, which is why he's here today. He spoke a little earlier about Strauss and Arendt. He may reprise some of that, but for now, he's here primarily to give us a talk on his current work on Leo Strauss. So, Thomas Meyer, thank you.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you also for your interest in this talk. I understand you are all very busy because of several conferences and other things going on here at BART. And yes, I changed the topic a little bit, or not a little bit, I changed the topic because I have to confess I failed in a way. I didn't mention that during my lunch talk, hospitalized for several weeks, so I failed to write a proper paper on Arendt and Strauss, as I announced, comparing their concepts of modernity and the polis. But I think from my paper that I was able to prepare for this event, we can easily go to these topics. My current research, or my research interest now is really an intellectual biography of Leo Strauss, because I think we have a lot of rumors. We have Straussians, anti-Straussians, liberal Straussians, all kinds of Straussians. Strauss is now part of the agenda, but what we do not have is something like a framework, a narrative to reconstruct, it is my impression, to reconstruct his thoughts. And I think it is a proper way, and it is a good old tradition that we start in to understand someone, we reconstruct his life. And the first surprise when you read Leo Strauss is that he always was interested in his own life. He is one of the rare examples of intellectual who wrote his whole life autobiographical pieces. We have that not in Heidegger, we do not have that in Sartre or in others. We have that in this extent only, as far as I can say, in Leo Strauss, and so that's how I want to begin. In the summer of 1962, Leo Strauss circulated a manuscript to a select circle of readers. He sent it on its way with the following words, quote, "I plan to bring out an English translation of my book on Spinoza and to supply it with a preface. The preface will come as close to a autobiography as is compatible with propriety." End of quote. The recipients of the manuscript were friends and acquaintances from the 1920s, including the world-famous Gershom Scholem, whose appetite for autobiographical essays from members of his generation was proverbial. Scholem had known Strauss since 1924, when both taught in Franz Rosenzweig's Freiem Jüdischen Lehrhaus in Frankfurt am Main. After a thorough reading of the manuscript, Scholem replied on 28 November 1962, I quote again, "You have rarely written anything more remarkable. I consider it your intellectual biography, in which one adventure of the mind and its failure is linked up to another. The only thing to which I take exception is that you skip over a few stages of your autobiography. The poor readers, who know less about you than I do, especially the poor Americans, who have no idea about these things, will be simply astonished, in English, baffled. For the time being, I will preserve my copy of the manuscript totally clean, because who knows whether you may not declare it apocryphal at the last moment." End of quote. The fact that Leo Strauss wrote an intellectual biography has not been properly appreciated by all his readers and interpreters. Of course, it is not an autobiography of the kind one gets from a 70-year-old actor. But neither does it follow the model Goethe used for Dichtung und Wahrheit. Scholem's astute reference to the adventures of the mind, in German Abenteuer des Geistes, a phrase that recalls the romantic Ludwig Tieck and expresses an alternative formulation of the idea of a theological novella, comes closer to the mark. In his intellectual autobiography, Strauss limits himself to what you might call the novel of development, Bildungsroman. Scholem was also right that a few stages of Strauss's autobiography would be hard for his American readers to appreciate. Hardly anyone in the USA could have known the debates about Zionism rehearsed in the Spinoza preface, except perhaps readers who were themselves involved. It is only since Heinrich Meyer published the greater part of Strauss's articles for Jewish papers and journals in his edition of Strauss' Gesammelte Schriften that even scholars could recognize what Scholem knew straight away. But this reticence is characteristic of Strauss's whole life. Throughout his career, Strauss was inclined to treat questions that involved him and his personal circumstances as questions of political philosophy that happened to manifest themselves in his historical context. This was not hybris. Rather, it expressed Strauss's conviction that both the question of the right life and the so-called Jewish question, that's how he puts it, were inseparable, bound up with his own fate. As a Jew in the 20th century who regarded himself as a political philosopher, Strauss's life was, if you will, shaped by upheaval. He tried to understand this process in terms of a tension that was not to be overcome, the tension between his Jewish origin and his political philosophy. Yet he could see that he was not the first who perceived this chasm and negotiated it in a productive way. Strauss drew strengths, especially in the dramatic years 1936 through 1937, when he was completely dependent on private assistance and the support of a few patrons, from engagement to the point of identification with figures in the history of ideas who also stood between philosophy and law. From here on, let's consider a little more objectively the facts at our disposal. Thanks to certain happy accidents, the history of Strauss's family can now be traced back to the late 17th century. Everything played out in a little known part of the present federal state of Hessen, in the middle of Germany. Over a good 300 years, the Strauss family moved on just once, from Amöneburg to Kirchheim, 2.7 miles away. The reason was that transportation was easier there. The ladies of Strauss's family came either from these places or from the outlying areas. In the 19th century, the Strauss family built a successful little business in fodder and cattle. Strauss's grandfather, Meyer Strauss, was a major contributor to the local Jewish primary school, played a significant role in rebuilding of the local synagogue, and was an elder of the community. Also, he professed orthodoxy. He was at the same time a member of the liberal Zentralverein Deutscher Staatsbürger jüdischen Glaubens. When he died, notices appeared in non-Jewish as well as Jewish newspapers of all political and religious orientations. Strauss's father and one of his brothers successfully kept up the business. The family owned at least 3 houses, evidence of their general prosperity. In the curriculum vitae from 1967, Strauss wrote for his former gymnasium in Marburg, 6 years before his death. He described his own way in the following, his own life in the following way. And now a very formal, typical German, old-fashioned CV. I quote: 1899, 20th September, born the son of Hugo Strauss and his wife Jenny, née David in Kirchheim. 1905 to 1908, attended the Jewish primary school in Kirchheim. 1908 to 1912, attended the Rektoratsschule in Kirchheim. 1912 to 1917, attended the Gymnasium Philippinum in Marburg. I will explain that later on. 1917 to 1922, study in philosophy at the universities of Marburg, Frankfurt, Berlin, Hamburg and Freiburg. December 1921, promotion to PhD in Hamburg. 1925 to 1932, Akademie für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. 1927 to 1932, participated in the preparation of the Jubilee edition, Jubiläumsausgabe of the Gesammelte Schriften of Moses Mendelssohn. 1932 to 1936, Fellow of the Rockefeller Foundation for the Social Sciences in France and England, that means in Paris, London, Cambridge. 1938 to 1949, and now a typical German CV, as I said, lecturer, assistant professor, associate professor, professor in the departments of political science and of philosophy, graduate faculty, New School for Social Research, New York City. 1949, ongoing professor of political science, Chicago. Summer 1953, Berkeley, guest professor. 1942 to 1955, guest professor in Jerusalem. 1959, ongoing Robert M. Hutchins professor, fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies, Princeton University, Doctor Honoris Causa, University of Hamburg. We have all written resumes in which we try to keep a goal in mind without losing sight of the truth. But as simple as it seems to present one's own life in terms of dates and institutions, it is also an exercise in construction and reconstruction. When such constructions and reconstruction make their way into archives from which they can be dug up by historians like me, they come to be called self-portraits. Over them stand warning signs that say careful, observe, authorial intention. The biographer of the political philosopher Leo Strauss must also observe these rules. Whatever the fine phrase intellectual biography implies, he must first of all be a radical historicist and no less fundamentally a skeptic. Let's play that out in terms of the document I've just quoted at length. Contrary to what he claims, Leo Strauss, Strauss never attended the Jewish primary school in Kirchheim. On the other hand, he was stationed on the Belgian front as a medical orderly and was wounded twice. He does not mention this. In much the same way, Strauss leaves out one semester of studying in Gießen. Yet, he mentions one semester that he spent in Berlin. Up to the year 1923, Strauss had acquired a high school qualification, 7 diplomas and a doctoral degree. But the statement that he received that degree in 1921 emphasizes the unusual age of the recipient, at least by the standards of the time. Strauss was just 22, yet the name of his advisor is absent, which was very unusual on the other hand, and this was Ernst Cassirer. In general, Strauss goes out of his way to present himself as a philosopher, but as a matter of fact, he took more courses in medicine at Marburg than in philosophy. In Frankfurt, Strauss matriculated as a student of history. He also regularly attended classes in mathematics and natural sciences, including zoology and experimental chemistry. One could find Strauss not only in a seminar on political science, but also in the lecture on the meaning and causes of mental illness. And he didn't just sign up, he actually took the courses. These observations don't alter Leo Strauss's nature, and there are good reasons for each discrepancy. But they have to be noted so that one can better understand what is going on. A more specific consideration arises if we compare Strauss's with the numerous other CVs handed down from the same period. But the document shows at least that Strauss's own views about the main events of life changed with the times. But a biographer cannot rest satisfied with comparison of the subject's statements to the accepted facts. He must show what all that has to do with the subject's writings, with his analysis, arguments and questions. That is a decisive step, but also the one that must be accompanied by fundamental doubt. Allow me to explain briefly what I mean. A precisely developed plan lies behind every one of Strauss's writings. These plans are often reconstructible through letters, excerpts and diaristic statements, as well as through surviving notes. That goes for the important writings, not for all the miscellany. But even those texts include hints about why they were written in such a way. Some of Strauss' writings have a programmatic character that sheds light on another. This is the case not only in the sense that they improve our interpretations of other texts, but also insofar as they may actually provide keys to later writings. One example is the anonymous whole that Strauss mentions in Thoughts on Machiavelli, but had already thoroughly explained in Natural Right and History. To some extent, all the writings from On Tyranny from 1948 onward are woven together like a net. If one takes the coherence of Strauss' life work seriously, as Strauss did, much more interesting, in many respects contrarian, but very enlightening master thinkers of the 20th century emerges from the apparently shadowy and in Heraclitus' sense dark political philosopher. In the rest of the lecture I will try to support this claim by applying the method I sketched to some of Strauss's texts of both the personal and the programmatic variety. For perhaps the autobiographical texts from the 1960s owe their character to Strauss, never good and at that point grammatically deteriorating health. It is well known that the inclination to become autobiographical increases toward the end of life. This is not the case with Strauss, as I would like to show by referring to a document from the early stages of his career. In addition to showing that Strauss autobiographical tendency is not limited to the 1960s, this document supports the suggestions that I've made so far. More precisely, it prepares them. I will begin with an extensive quote from an hitherto unknown text that Leo Strauss wrote on 16th August 1933 near Paris, where he had lived and worked as a Rockefeller Fellow since 3 October of the previous year. Just 2 months earlier in Paris, Strauss had married Miriam Petri, who had known him since the late 1920s and was recently widowed. She had one child, Thomas. Okay, I quote. I'm alone, as I haven't been for I don't know how long. I have detached myself from everything, and I think that's an unusual Strauss piece. I start again. I'm alone as I haven't been for I don't know how long. I have been detached myself from everything in order to find myself again. For I'm more concealed from myself than ever before. I used to be caught up in myself. Now I'm also entrapped by what one calls life. In other words, I'm speaking to myself for the first time since I was married. I'm speaking to myself for the first time since I was married. I shall once again take stock, as I used to do in days past. What do I know? What is clear to me? What do I understand? I imagine that I've become more mature. But does maturity mean having learned anything, understanding anything more thoroughly and better than before? Does one really learn anything from life? I believe so. I learned for the first time from the events in Germany, which enslaved me and mine, the meaning of freedom, political freedom. Whether our thoughts have any value depends on whether we have pursued something fully, whether we have drunk deeply of it. But we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see whether it is true that our thoughts owe their power to our experiences. In the end, the opposite is more accurate. But we leave these generalizations behind. We prefer to take stock in the tried and true way. I can think only in conversation with others, and in practice that means in conversation with books. So we'll proceed by taking note of books that I have thoroughly understood.
What year is this? I'm sorry.
33. It is August 33. End of quote. This testimonial is a document by and about Leo Strauss that has much greater significance than its specific content suggests. The excerpt is an important piece of evidence that Strauss's life and work are not separable. As Strauss reflects on himself and writes down his thoughts, he considers nothing less than the meaning of his own existence. The sort of thinking that Strauss engages in here is not the kind that one periodically turns to or with which one passes time. In the 1920s and 30s, that sort of thing was a topos that acquired a wonderfully ironic meaning, as in the famous bon mot of the Heidegger students. I'm totally resolved, but I don't know what for. Strauss, on the other hand, takes it very seriously. For Strauss, thinking worthy of the name is an existential act. But this existential act has nothing to do with a retrospective resolution. Instead, it is the expression of an internal orientation to which there is no alternative. The thinking in which Strauss is engaged gives clear expression to unavoidable question. In doing so, it has to abstract from all foundations, even and especially personal identity. The radical doubt that begins with one's own personality is the presupposition of philosophy. More specifically, the transition from philosophy to political philosophy is completed in the moment when self-doubt has to articulate itself, and in doing so alters the object of analysis. In this respect, the document from which I quoted can be placed in direct connection with the third chapter of Natural Right and History, which presents the origin of the idea of natural right as a kind of fall of man. But let's look again at the quote. As Strauss himself notes, this letter to and about himself is a product of long habit. It is also obvious that Strauss knew his chosen genre very well. The tone betrays a carefully calculated degree of distance, but this distance does not lead Strauss either into fashionable Nietzschean effusions or into narcissisms. Strauss remains at the center of his own reflection in order to derive the objects of analysis from his own experience and to take account of the development of his own thought. In addition, we find in this text something more than a kind of philosophical discussion with the goal of introspection that up to now was unknown in Strauss. And if you read Strauss' research, I think you agree. In it, we are witnesses to an intimate process of taking stock. This reflection begins with a particular person, then turns to a skeptical consideration of the category of life, which was in every mouth in 1933. The category acquires a new meaning through the specific situation in which the author found himself. For the life in question, it is the life of an, as he called it, enslaved Jew, who was simultaneously experiencing political freedom for the first time. In this respect, Strauss defines his understanding of politics through being enslaved by National Socialism. Thrown back into the externally dictated category of life, which dominated the political sphere more than ever before, Strauss seeks a point of exit from his conundrum. He would articulate this point of exit in a book, The Study of Hobbes, published in England in 1936, which Strauss conceives as a history of the transformation of the concepts of fame and honor. I'm a German, that is why I use all the genitives. Of the transformation of the concepts of fame and honor, as he explains later in the same quotation. The fact that Strauss translates the political situation and its direct influence on his personal fate into the history of political philosophy has immense consequences, as I can see, for understanding his intellectual development. The idea of esoteric and exoteric writing that he would develop later has not only its origin, but also its slightly mysterious basis and structure in this translation. I will return to this issue. Before doing that, however, I will take up a broader point about Strauss's general achievement that closely connected to what I have just said. I began a little boastfully maybe by announcing that the document under discussion has greater significance as a whole than the specific statements that it contains. That is because I believe it represents a kind of prototype for Strauss's work. All Strauss books are eminently autobiographical. In Letter to Students, Strauss describes his Spinoza work of 1930, his first official book after the dissertation on Jacobi in 1922 with Cassirer, as a justification for rejecting Jewish observance. The Philosophy and Law book, now famously discussed here in the States and translated twice, of 1935, concludes his engagement with Zionism. He conceives the Hobbes book as a case study in the modern reshaping of the ancient inventory of extramoral virtues in the political sphere. Strauss's commentary on Xenophon's Eros shows the dangerous proximity of philosophy and dictatorship, a theme that is taken up again in Natural Right and History. The work of Xenophon, in other words, is a study of Hitler avant la lettre that reveals the extreme danger of abuse inherent in the philosophical ideal of education without reference to Strauss' own early political insights. One need only take the explicit references in the introduction seriously to understand what's going on. That's my interpretation. Persecution and the Art of Writing superseded Strauss' earlier efforts, thus presents a Strauss who wants to take the bull by the horns in a different way. As notes from the early 1940s make clear, this involves a total revision of previous answer to the fundamental question of the relation between philosophy and revelation, a question that Strauss could not leave unanswered after the Shoah. I could go on. On the deepest level, Natural Right and History is a book from the late 1920s, provided you are willing to link the systematizing effort that led Strauss to his critique of Karl Mannheim with a general consideration of natural right. The overall thrust of the treatments of Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and last but not least Rousseau is that the original doubt concerning social science, namely its ideal of objectivity, made it incapable of thinking politically, was correct. Finally, the Machiavelli book expresses Strauss's own thought. That is what the Straussians say. Here, with the help of lifetime work, Strauss makes perhaps his most radical attempt to address the question of the conditions of the possibility of philosophical self-justification and their still unresolved connection to revelation. That problem is taken up again in Strauss' analysis of the works of Aristophanes, in which literature takes the place of revelation. Then, in the great introduction to the epoch-making edition of the Guide of the Perplexed from 1963, Strauss unveils the blueprints of his book on Machiavelli and Aristophanes. The structure determines the contents because the contents admit of no other structure. You could understand the interplay of structure and content as the direct consequence of Strauss' turn to esoteric writing. These are books that contain, as it were, their own secrets, their own life. Recall a sentence from the 1933 text. I can think only in conversation with others, and in practice that means in conversation with books. So we will proceed by taking note of books that I have thoroughly understood. As you see, I hope so, as you can see maybe, I accord this text a foundational function in my forthcoming intellectual biography of Strauss. I think I do so for good reasons. First of all, the document I've quoted doesn't stand alone. Similar texts, and nobody transcribed them before, similar text, and also the Strauss relatives were not aware that they were part of the thousands, or maybe 10,000 pages, untranscribed today, that reconstruct Strauss' thought from his own perspective, can be found up to 1945. One must conclude that we are dealing here with an integral part of his work. These texts are, as it were, preparation for Strauss' formal writings that foreground the first-person perspective. As such, we get from them a general sense of themes that characterize his later texts. The eye of these texts is always bound up with Strauss' attempt to understand his own time in the medium of political philosophy. That era is the living matrix within which Strauss sees himself as anchored. Leo Strauss never accepted himself when he took others' personalities and works under consideration. On the contrary, he was, if you like, the primary object of his own reflections. And that was really a surprise when I came through these papers. Strauss applied to his own thought his premise that one should understand them also as it understood himself, and that one must therefore take every detail into consideration. That is the famous methodological quote. You find it always in The City and Man and all the other books, but nobody used it to understand Strauss. Consequently, this kind of intellectual introspection and inspection began early. Strauss' practice of self-integration, of writing about himself and scrutinizing the results, didn't change in the course of the decades. Only after long, and as the surviving documents show, highly searching scrutiny of his thought and publication, did Strauss turn in the end of the 50s to his friends, who were not infrequently overwhelmed by his questions. Strauss took his opinions and not just his dispositions into the public. If there were nothing to say, whether because the themes did not interest him or seemed superficial, he could even remain silent for hours in company. But he would become more and more lively as conversation turned to real questions. Every Strauss interpreter who fails to consider the introverted element of Strauss' personality and radically question-posing dimension of his thought takes a step in the wrong direction. The occasions on which Strauss considered himself, and above all, on which he placed his ideas under the magnifying glass, are an important part of his work, a concomitant part of which that was his living self-understanding. The task is to weigh this fact to accord to its proper significance. As soon as they are written down, personal reflections count as so-called self-portraits. Again, many speak of ego documents nowadays, as do diary entries, letters, excerpts, and marginalia. In intellectual biography, such evidence has to be carefully weighed and then compared with the actual work. That goes both for Strauss' published reflections on his life and work, and for the self-portraits in which he offers explicit remarks about the function of a book or an essay in the context of his biography. The latter is the case when Strauss writes repeatedly to a friend that the study of Spinoza's Critique of Religion, I mentioned that, first published in 1930, was a justification, or more precisely a defense, of his conscious distancing from his religious origin and the connected turn from Jerusalem to Athens. But published autobiographical documents, like the famous foreword to the 1965 American edition of the work on Spinoza, also require the same careful evaluation. To take them simply as the keys, thank you very much, David, to take them simply as the keys to Strauss' work means undervaluing his capacity for historical distancing and genuine reflection. Also, the person Leo Strauss and his concern with himself cannot be left out of consideration. They do not offer the royal road to understanding his thought, of course. I don't talk about reduction, so to say. I say this expressly in opposition to a great part of the Strauss literature, which deals with these matters in a consistently haphazard way. In most cases, what is sought in the self-reflective autobiographical writings is the practical handhold that one misses in the philosophical text, or that makes the latter appear plausible. An intellectual biography can offer a more complex interpretation, I think, since it always presumes the mutual conditioning of self-reflection and philosophical reflection, and thus possesses a special sensitivity to the interaction between both areas. You may object at this point that if Strauss threaded himself and his intellectual development under his own methodological premises, that must mean that he proceeded both esoterically and exoterically with himself. That is simply not the case. Strauss knew the literature in which an eye places itself under a microscope and tests its own positions very well. So it would be completely mistaken to think that Strauss and his writings are hidden behind a kind of bulletproof glass and that only a few possess the code for removing the protective shield, a superstition that sadly plays a motivating role in countless treatments of Strauss. Studying these texts, then, is at least partly an exercise in dispelling a myth. My exercise with Strauss texts allow me to assert, on the contrary, that as a rule Strauss said very precisely what he actually thought, what method he applied to a question, and how the solution looked to him. Let me offer a final explanation for the significance of this document. It gives access to Strauss' radicalism. Quote, Strauss was a fighter for his whole life, end of quote. So a very close student of Strauss insisted to me several times. This student saw his judgment symbolically confirmed in a picture Strauss kept on his own desk at home in Hyde Park that showed him as a soldier in the First World War. Of course, Strauss was not a fighter in the sense of the German writer Ernst Jünger. Strauss was a fighter because he attacked dogmas. Strauss thought it was impossible to be a fighter in behalf of a derivative standpoint that owed its foundation to the rejection of classical and medieval philosophy. Specifically, liberalism was not an option for Strauss because the dogmas of liberalism deviated from the traditional idea of natural hierarchy. The fighter Strauss dedicated himself to the task of placing those dogmas in question. At the same time, he fought to establish the irreducible confrontation between Athens and Jerusalem as the decisive opposition in the question of truth. In Chicago, Strauss concentrated above all on the ways in which paradigms, methodologies and theories turn into ideologies. He tested them not only for their inner coherence, but also devoted himself to showing that their rarely stated goal of influencing social processes was the core of their existence. Strauss as Mannheimian, of course.
Unheimlich Mannheim.
Unheimlich Mannheimian way.
Okay.
We all have our traumas. Yeah. I think so. Strauss was also a fighter to that extent that he remained true to the aims of the quoted essay. On the whole, one must say that he spent his life thinking through his experiences in Weimar as an exile. And as an exile, of course. In Strauss' view, mere negotiations, legitimation through procedures, and other liberal democratic forms of communication could not longer guarantee security in an agonistic world. The acid test for this conviction was always experience. But this experience was always placed in question by means of reflection, and that is very important. Just as tradition does not represent value in itself, experience is not a sufficient ground for philosophical reflection. In his whole life, Strauss never changed his position. But that was, so to say, how he introduced the idea of life and life experience. Now let me provide, and the Monty Python would say now to something completely different, but it's not completely different. Keep that in mind, and now we move not from Amöneburg to Kirchhain, but from, let me say, Weimar and exile experiences at a new school to Chicago. It's the same story at a different place. Chicago and Strauss, those are famously more than the names of a city and a professor. Over the decades, the public perception of Strauss came to be totally connected to the place. It was In the preface to the English translation of Spinoza's Critique of Religion, I mentioned that several times, that Strauss readers discovered for the first time that he had a life before 1949. Yet Strauss' activities as a teacher are not the subject of the remarks that follow, but nor are his many famous students. We can talk about them, of course. There are a lot of stories to tell, who are too quickly described as Straussians, nor the equally hasty critique that dismisses Strauss as a Pied Piper. I mentioned that in the lunch talk. Instead, I would like to present a textual snapshot that was decisive for Strauss' course in Chicago. Before I quote the document, let me review Strauss' path to Chicago in just a few words. In 1936, Strauss visited Chicago as part of a wider trip. With the support of the Rockefeller Foundation and furnished with recommendations from Ernest Barker, Robert Tawney and Hayo Holborn, they were all historians or social scientists and, maybe historians of ideas. Strauss, who had found himself in existential difficulties in England, was trying to find a place in the United States. The trip concluded without success. In Chicago, Strauss met with John Ulrich Neff, but his request that he be accepted by the political science department remained without effect. Richard McKeon expressed serious reservations when responded to Strauss's inquiries. In 1937, Strauss was put in touch with Salo Wittmeyer Baron by his brother-in-law Paul Krauss and his former supervisor, the philosopher Julius Gutmann. After he looked over Strauss's paper, Wittmeyer Baron, and talked with him in London, Wittmeyer Baron invited Strauss to Columbia University on a half-year research grant. The goal was to put together an anthology for the 1800th birthday of Moshe Ben Maimon, which would occur in 1938. You maybe know that there was, still today there's a lot of discussion, born in 1135 or born in 1138. So the Germans decided to celebrate in 1935 and the Americans decided to celebrate in 1938. So luckily for Strauss, which would occur in 1938, as I said. The anthology never appeared, but years later, but circumstances in New York revived Strauss' old contacts with Emil Lederer and other scholars at the New School. As is well known, the New School offered Strauss a temporary lectureship, while he also accepted freelance positions with various Jewish research institutions. In 1938, Strauss finally achieved resettlement in the United States, seemed promising. In 1942, the economic historian, Christian socialist and tireless campaigner higher education, Robert Tawney, whose advice was sought by both the president of Chicago University, Robert Hutchins, and John Ulrich Neff, reported back he had met Strauss in New York, where he found him intellectually matured. In short, the man had to go to Chicago. Yet it would take another 3 years until the political science department and the Committee on Social Thought reached an agreement about Strauss. It was Neff who actually scouted Strauss in New York, and his discussions with Strauss were not without impact in Chicago. Above all, Leonard Wright of the Political Science Department showed interest. This in turn encouraged President Robert Hutchins to take an active role. He appointed Hans Morgenthau as a kind of spy in order to find out more about Strauss. Neff, for his part, asked Edward Shilts to keep an eye on the activities of Wright and Morgenthau. As you see, it could almost be a script by Jean Le Carré. It was an extensive letter from the Shilts to Neff that, so to speak, sealed Strauss' fate. I will quote it in a moment. By the end of August 1948, salary negotiations were underway. Yet Strauss had to ask Hutchins for postponement of the decision, and Strauss, who felt himself to be under obligation to the New School's president Alvin Johnson, did want to proceed before had talked with his old confidant. Yet where Strauss would end up in Chicago was still unclear. Finally, the committee placed the appointment at the disposal of the political science department. According to Schills, Neff had come to the conclusion, I mentioned that in the morning or during my lunch talk, to the conclusion that Strauss was no Croesus and was not really cultivated enough for the great tasks of higher education. Maybe you read a piece by Strauss and remember that he was not really educated, as Neff said. His judgment was clear-cut and never revised. But what did Schills say? I give an excerpt from the decisive letter to Neff. I quote, and I found this letter also accidentally in hundreds of thousand letters of the Hutchins and Neff papers. I never saw such an archive in my life. Neff wrote. Schultz. Very good, very good. You're not tired.
Attention.
Yeah, you paid attention. Yeah, you paid attention. That's wonderful. Schultz wrote the following lines to Neff. Strauss was very quiet, spoke seldom, and when he did, his comments were not at the center of the discussion. That's a nice description. He leveled up a bit more when we discussed the role of the Vatican in the 20th century politics, but did not discuss subjects so much as he did the connections of some of the topics we mentioned to intellectual history. When we spoke about the relative status of professors, that is what they always do, in Europe and America, he was not very spirited in his contribution. After dinner, Schultz, another Schultz, I don't know who this Schultz was, and after dinner Schultz left us, and the other spy, that's my remark, Morgenthau and I went to his room at the club. Somehow we began to speak about the difference between Aristotle and Aquinas' conceptions of natural law. He became transformed. He became excited and enthusiastic and spoke with passion and clarity and in an eloquent manner. His mind began to work in a most admirable way. He made fine comments on the treatment of power, honor in classical and post-medieval political philosophy, the development of the conception of self-preservation in Montesquieu, with a few words on the importance of that conception in classical economics, the importance of the Arabic commentators in the elaboration of Aristotle's conception of natural law, etc., etc., etc. It was a pleasure to listen to him and to watch him as he spoke. I have no doubt about the subtlety of his mind, his penetration to the important issues of political and moral philosophy, his great and accurate scholarship, his rigor and clarity. I do not know how far he goes beyond the limits of political philosophy broadly understood in a philosophical context. I could not guess what his attitude is toward literature, history, the tasks of education and American civilizations from anything which he said explicitly. But I would surmise that his concern about the last is not great. It is on that point alone that the question of his full incorporation into the committee becomes difficult.
Did you say love or life?
Life.
Life.
Life? Difficult.
No, whether it was his conception about... I thought you said love, and I was a little taken aback.
No. I said nothing. I said also life.
Life, okay, that's sure. Okay, I understand.
It is only at that point alone that the question of his full incorporation into the committee becomes difficult. End of the long quote. Thus was the judgment of Strauss expressed. After some to and fro with the new school, Strauss got a very good offer from the political science department, but he never made it onto the Committee on Social Thought. Nowadays, all people think Strauss is a member of the Committee on Social Thought, but you see now why he was never a member, because he was no Proteus, according to John Ulrich Neff's phrase, which was often repeated to Hutchins and others who shared in the decision. In connection with his move to Chicago, Strauss was offered 6 lectures under the auspices of the prestigious Walgreen Lectures. Since we happily possess the original manuscript, it can be said in good conscience that Natural Right History is an almost completely new book. The lectures concentrate for the most part on Max Weber. Henry Jaffa and Thomas Pengel provided us with an impression of the lectures, the original lectures, but both leave out the actual conclusion, which conveys a great deal about the, if you like, new American Strauss. And now I have to give an interpretation because I'm from the philosophy department, and maybe you think now 45 minutes with nice stories, I have to give you an interpretation of the text, of course. The text in the archive reads as follows. I quote, that's the end of the original Walgreen Lectures from 1949. They are unpublished. Permit me to conclude these lectures with a personal remark. The subject of these lectures has been of such a nature that I could not help touching on issues regarding which all men of goodwill feel strongly. I do not believe that I have hurt anyone's feeling, but I might have said things that conflict with the most cherished convictions held by some of you. As I said, he's a fighter. This cannot be helped. One cannot try to reach clarity on the issues regarding which clarity is most needed without questioning all cherished convictions, whether they are one's own or those of others. Whether we like it or not, we have to follow the model of the master of those who know. The master of those who know. It has been well said of Aristotle, solet Aristoteles quaere pugnam. Aristotle has a habit of seeking a fight. I hope you see the connection. He is seeking a fight, that's Strauss. He is seeking a fight not because he loves fight and enmity, but because he loves peace and friendship. But